Hello, it's a great pleasure to be here in my own right. Because last time I was here, I was I was replacing Edmund White. So I kind of my last experience was getting on stage to a tent full of mild disappointment. I, I'm going to talk today mostly about the Penguin book of the British short story and how I put it together. I want to give you a proper flavour of these three writers that I'm going to talk about. And then at the end, I'm going to cheekily sneak myself into proceedings by reading a short story that I wrote myself. I didn't put myself in the anthology because I thought it would be a bit insufferable to do so, but I don't see why I shouldn't talk about myself for a bit. The Penguin book of the British short stories. When we were launching it, my editor. Simon Winder said at the dinner that they'd got rather more than they'd bargained for when they signed me up, and he just said to me at the beginning of the process, "Would you like to put together a new Penguin book of the British short story, because it hasn't been done for ages, and you seem to be as good as anybody to do it." So I said yes, because I love the short story. I'm always reading it. But then I thought, immediately after agreeing it, well, what most anthologists do, I have to say, is just spend a couple of days thinking about all the short stories that they really like, put them in the anthology, send them off and collect the cheque. And it seemed to me that it would be a bit more honourable if I just took the assumption that actually I thought I knew something about the British short story, but I should assume that I didn't know anything at all about it. And my model for this was my old tutor at university, a wonderful man called Roger Lonsdale, who, when he was teaching me, he would just brought out one of the greatest anthologies the world has ever seen, which is the Oxford Book of 18th Century Verse. And Roger had produced it by the simple means of reading every piece of verse ever published in the 18th century and deciding what was good or not. It's a remarkable anthology. It's really, I don't think it's ever going to be better. So I thought, well, that's probably the thing to do. So what I did, I wiped my mind free of all my favourite short stories, and I just went down to the London Library and the British Library every day for about 2 years. And I just typed the words "and other stories" into the computer catalogue, and that produced volume after volume after volume of collected short stories by many people that I'd never heard of, as well as people who I knew of perfectly well. And I read all of those, and then I thought, well, a lot of short stories, they weren't published in collections. A lot of short stories never got to the dignity of hardback publication by a single author. A lot of them were just published in magazines. And we sort of know about this a little bit. We know about that the Sherlock Holmes short stories, for instance, were first published in the Strand magazine. But the Strand magazine came out every month between 1891 and 1930-something. And in every issue, there were 4 or 5 short stories. What are the other short stories that ran alongside Sherlock Holmes? There are lots and lots of magazines like that at the time. Between 1890 and the First World War, it's been calculated, there was something like 23 or 24 magazines in London devoted to the publication of short fiction. That's a lot of short fiction to get through. A lot of it was enormously popular at the time, surprisingly enormously popular. The explanation, of course, is that between 1890 and 1914, it's the period between the first generation of universal education, so everybody could read suddenly, and it's before the invention of the cinema, when everybody stopped reading so much and started going to see terrible movies with Mary Pickford in them. So it's a very, very rich area, and those magazines, they carried on for decades after, until probably the 1980s or 1990s, they're kind of trailing off. So I thought, let me assume that I don't really know about stuff at all. Let me just sit down and read these things. And I just sat down and read through quite a lot of journals from beginning to end, and just plucked something out when it seemed quite kind of interesting. And it did seem to me that a lot of assumptions that we have about the short story as a form are actually completely wrong. And one of the things that emerged quite quickly is that the short story published in magazines is very, very much more experimental and tentative in its explorations than a novel of the same period would necessarily be. And this seems like a very kind of strange thing. I mean, why would a short story in a commercial magazine be so much more weird and peculiar than any novel of the period could be? But it is undoubtedly the case. You come across some stories in the 1850s in mass market magazines about somebody falling through the surface of the earth and ending up in a country ruled by the skeleton king, and suddenly there are kind of body parts chasing each other. It's extraordinary. Or stories about talking dachshunds, or there's a story in the 1890s I came across about somebody being sliced in half by a cannonball, and the morally approved half goes off in one direction, the evil half goes off in the other direction. And if you know Calvino, that's exactly the story that he wrote 50 years later, and I often wondered whether he had come across this in the pages of a mass market newspaper. So why was it that this was possible? Why isn't isn't it universally a kind of mass market popular fiction, very cautious about its readership? Well, I think the reason is that the editors of these magazines, they felt they wouldn't actually lose very much if the fifth story towards the back didn't work at all. If this kind of weird science fiction, fantasy, experimental sort of piece of writing, it might only be kind of 3 or 4 pages long. If the readers like it, then we'll run another one. If the readers don't like it, then we haven't lost anything. So it's much easier for an editor in that position to run something really outre and out there than it is for a publisher to take on a novel in that sort of vein. So that was one of the interesting little discoveries. The other thing, which I think comes from the same source, is that these short stories, the publication of short stories, it's a very useful way for quite marginalised social groups to get into print. And from very early on, there are all sorts of voices from the edges of society that find themselves, just exploring in fiction what their lives are like and what their kind of view of society is. We see a lot of short stories from really the 1870s, the 1880s on, about immigrant groups, for instance. There's a very good writer called Israel Zangwill who was publishing short stories about about Jewish immigrants in the East End very early on, and there are all sorts of stories about similar groups going right up until um, the uh, the Windrush generation in the 1940s. An editor of a magazine might very well say, we want to hear this particular voice. Here's a little sketch from somebody who has just arrived in the country. We want to hear about their view of life. That's one kind of marginalised group that that gets a hearing. It's also much easier for a excuse me. It's also much easier for an editor to find a little corner for a working class writer writing about working class life, for women who might not have the women from quite ordinary backgrounds that might not have the time or the contacts to get themselves into print in a major way, can nevertheless find time clearly to write 2,000, 3,000 words about something quite close to their life and to interest a sympathetic editor. So the short story as a form starts to be quite a good way for all sorts of people from all sorts of corners of society to get into print. One of the striking things that I found was that that from really very, very early on, it's possible for gay and lesbian voices to get into print, and for versions of those lives to be described. One of the very first stories in the book is a scandalous story by Henry Fielding about a lesbian relationship in the 1740s. Sorry. So that was something that I wanted to have some kind of sense of the range of society, the range of literary endeavour, and the range of literary forms that could be kind of squashed into this thing called the short story. What the short story actually was in the end, and how to define a short story, was rather a tricky one. I think that people are never really going to agree about what a short story should be, what a short story is, and when short stories actually began to exist. I saw that in the blurb for this event, I'm said to suggest that the British have been very good at the short story since Chaucer, which is quite an interesting claim, because I think the short story did not begin with Chaucer, because Chaucer was in verse. But apart from that, I think you can divide scholars of the short story into people who think that the short story is as old as time, and scholars who, like me, are a little bit more tempted by the idea that the short story began when people started describing it as a short story, which is about the 1860s, 1870s. Now, I'm going to, that's really just to give a sense, sorry. That's really just to give a sense of the short story and the kind of what I discovered by putting the anthology together. And I really just want to talk a little bit about three writers who emerged very strongly from my deliberations, and I think there's three highlights of the anthology in the end. The first one is Elizabeth Taylor, and Elizabeth Taylor was a simply wonderful technician of fiction. I think she has an extraordinary kind of lucid way of portraying people in groups, of people's interactions, of the way that people's personalities kind of leap out and are sometimes very apparent in an instant way. Not every author can do that, but Elizabeth Taylor just has this skill, which is very suited to the short story, of being able to render somebody almost from the first moment they venture onto they appear in a sentence of hers. There's a kind of concision about her that's ideally suited, I think, to the short story. There's also a keen awareness, which I think is very English and perhaps very much of her particular period between the late 1940s and the early 1970s, of where people stand in the great kind of the great English comedy of social class. You can always tell where people stand in her fiction in relation to each other. There's also a great kind of enthusiasm in Elizabeth Taylor for the quite clean, enclosed form. And the short stories that I put in the anthology, and the one I'm going to read a little bit from, is called In and Out the Houses. And it's a simply brilliant short story, I think. It's a late short story by her. And it's a very unusual thing. It's a farce, miniature farce, in which only one character ever goes anywhere. And it tells the story of a small girl. She's maybe 11 or 12 years old. And she lives in a village. She's known by the village to be writing a novel, and they all rather dread it. And she spends her days going from one house to another, gossiping and gathering information and spying on people. They're all simply terrified of her. I'm going to read a little bit from... I'm going to read a little bit in which Kitty, as she's called, is going from one person to another. She's just turned up at Mrs. Glazier's house. "Shall I help you prepare the mise en place?" Kitty inquired of Mrs. Glazier. Mr. Glazier wouldn't touch it. "I've told you he will only eat English food." "But you have ravioli, that's Italian." "I just keep it as a stand-by," Mrs. Glazier said scornfully. She was very huffy and put out these days, especially with Mrs. de Vries next door and her getting the better of her every time. Annette de Vries was French, and didn't they all know it? Mrs. Glazier, as a result, had become violently insular. "I can make ravioli," Kitty said, letting the mise en place go, for she was not absolutely certain about it. "Mrs. Prout has just been teaching me. She and Mr. Prout have television trays by the fire, and then they sit and crack walnuts and play cards, and then they have hot milk and whiskey and go to bed. I think it's very nice and cosy, don't you? Mr. Glazier likes a proper sit-down meal when he gets back. Did you happen to see Tiger anywhere down the lane?" "No, but I expect he's next door. I told you they're bitches on heat. You ought to shut him up." "It's their affair to shut theirs up." "Well, I'm just calling there, so I'll shoo him off." She had decided to cut short this visit. Mrs. Glazier was so bad-tempered these days and hardly put herself out at all to give a welcome, and every interesting thing Kitty told her served merely to annoy. "And I must get on with my jugged hare," Mrs. Glazier said, making no attempt to delay the departure. "It should be marinating in the port wine by now," she added grandly, "and I must make the soup and the croutons." "Well, then, I'll be going," Kitty said, edging towards the door. "And apricot mousse," Mrs. Glazier called out after her, as if she were in a frenzy. "Shall I prepare your mise en place?" Kitty inquired of Mrs. de Vries, trying her luck again. "My, we are getting professional," said Mrs. de Vries, but her mind was really on what Kitty had just been telling her. Soup and jugged hare, she was thinking. What a dreadful meal. She was glazing a tureen of chicken livers and wished that all the village might see her work of art, but having Kitty there was the next best thing. "What's that?" she asked as Kitty put the jar of apple jelly on the table. "I have to take it to the vicarage on my way home. It's some of Mrs. Prout's apple jelly." Mrs. de Vries gave it a keen look and notched up 1 point to Mrs. Prout. She notched up another when she heard about the ravioli and wondered if she had underestimated the woman. I shooed that tiger away, Kitty said. The wretched cur. He is driving Topaz insane. Kitty mooched around the kitchen, peeking and prying. Mrs. de Vries was the only one in the village to possess a mandolin for cutting vegetables. There was a giant pestle and mortar, a wicker bread basket, ropes of Spanish onions, and a marble cheese tray. You can pound the fish for me if you have the energy, said Mrs. de Vries. As this was not a house where she was made to wash her hands first, Kitty immediately set to work. I was just going to have pears, Mrs. de Vries said in a half-humorous voice, but if the glaziers are going in for apricot mousse, I had better pull my socks up. That remark, of course, is strictly entre nous. Then Mrs. de Vries pulled her socks up and made a big apple tart, Kitty told her mother. I have warned you before, Kitty. What you see going on in people's houses, you keep to yourself or you stay out of them. Is that finally and completely understood? Yes, Mother, Kitty said meekly. My dear girl, I couldn't eat it. I couldn't eat another thing, said Mr. Glazier, confronted by the apricot mousse. A 3-course meal. Why, I shouldn't sleep all night if I had any more. The hare alone was ample. I think Mr. de Vries would do better justice to his dinner, said Mrs. Glazier bitterly. She had spent all day cooking and was exhausted. It's not much fun slaving away, not being appreciated, and what on earth can I do with all the leftovers? Finish them up tomorrow and save yourself a lot of trouble. Glumly, Mrs. Glazier washed the dishes and suddenly thought of the Prouts sitting peacefully beside their fire, cracking walnuts, playing cards. She felt ill done by as she stacked the remains of dinner in the fridge, but was perfectly certain that, lie as she might have to Kitty in the morning, the whole village should not know that for the 2nd day running the Glaziers were having soup and jugged hare and apricot mousse. The second writer I want to talk about a little bit doesn't really need any introduction. Well, I thought this. It's Kipling. I thought he didn't need any introduction, but then in the later stages of preparing this, I did sit next to somebody who I'd always thought of as quite a well-read person who airily confessed they had no idea that Kipling had ever written any short stories. So maybe, the short story is that part of somebody's work that really kind of needs a bit of attention drawing to it. Kipling, I think, was the short story writer that's very much very far away from the particular view of the short story as a kind of sensitive, internal, reflective thing. He was very interested in all sorts of rather noisy bits of the world, the way that people's public lives are turned into sorts of performances. And he was very interested in how large-scale endeavours fail. One of the most fascinating and heartrending parts of his work are the short stories that he wrote after he lost all faith in the First World War. He was quite a supporter of the First World War at the start, and as you may know, his son was killed in terrible circumstances. And his stories about the First World War from later on, Mary Postgate and The Gardener in particular, are absolutely heartbreaking short stories. I thought rather than go for those, I would go for a short story that's always haunted me because it seems to be inviting you to respond to it in one way, but it's a short story called The Village That Voted the Earth Was Flat, is a small group of wealthy men driving their cars in the country in 1912, 1913, are, as they see it, unjustly charged with speeding and driving dangerously. And they mount a campaign against this village to make it look ridiculous, and so the squire of the village, who's also a member of parliament, to drag him through the mud. One of the men is the owner of a newspaper, another one is an MP, a third is the owner of a chain of music halls. And they contrive to persuade the village to get drunk and then vote in favour of a motion at a public debate that the earth is flat. And at that point, the whole village is dragged into ridicule. The bit I'm going to read, it's from the first unveiling at Music Hall of the song which is going to bring the village into state of worldwide mockery. It's such a public and noisy and sumptuous piece of writing that it's quite difficult to imagine this taking place in a short story at all. It seems much, much bigger than our idea of the short story, but this is absolutely within Kipling's concept of the short story. The thing that haunts me about this short story is that it really has a sense. It was published about 2 or 3 months before the outbreak of the First World War, and it does have a sense of things getting so out of control and that you just do not know where this madness is going to end. The short story ends with the breakdown of all order in the House of Commons, but this is the bit that I want to read to you, which is I think it's the best evocation of what it was like to be in a very glamorous, rather vulgar music hall in the kind of immediately pre-war period. The owner of the music hall is called Bat. His big star is Vidal or Dahl. A week later, I think it was, Bat Masquerier telephoned me to come to the Trefoil. "It's your turn now," he said. "Come to the stage box." I went, and as Bat's guest was received as royalty is not, we sat well back and looked out on the packed thousands. It was Morgiana and Drexel, that fluid and electric review which Bat, though he gave Lafone the credit, really created. "Yes," said Bat dreamily, after Morgiana had given the nasty jar to the 40 thieves in their 40 oil combinations. "As you say, I've got 'em, and I can hold 'em. What a man does doesn't matter much, and how he does it don't matter either. It's the when, the psychological moment. Press can't make up for it, money can't, brains can't. A lot's luck, but all the rest is genius. I'm not speaking about my people now. I'm talking of myself." Then Vidal, she was the only one who dared, knocked at the door and stood behind us all, alive and panting as Morgiana. Lafone was carrying the police court scene, and the house was ripped up crossways with laughter. "Ah, tell a fellow now," she asked me for the 20th time. "Did you love Nellie Farron when you were young?" "Did we love her?" I answered. "If the eye and the sky and the sea..." "There were 3 million of us, Dahl, and we worshipped her." "How did she get it across?" Dahl went on. "She was Nellie. The houses used to coo over her when she came on." "I've had a good deal, but I've never been cooed over yet," said Dahl wistfully. "It isn't the how, it's the when," Bart repeated. "Ah." He leaned forward as the house began to rock and peal full-throatedly. Dahl fled. I should explain. What follows is a ridiculous folk dance that they've made up and ascribed to this idiotic village. It's called the Gubby. A sinuous and silent procession was filing into the police court to a scarcely audible accompaniment. It was dressed, but the world and all its picture palaces know how it was dressed. It danced, and it danced, and it danced the dance which bit all humanity in the leg for half a year, and it wound up with a lockstep finale that mowed the house down in swathes, sobbing and aching. Somebody in the gallery moaned, "Oh, God, the Gubby!" and we heard the word run like a shudder, for they had not a full breath left among them. Then Dal came on, an electric star in her dark hair, the diamonds flashing in her 3-inch heels of vision that made no sign for 30 counted seconds, while the police court scene dissolved behind her into Morgiana's manicure palace, and they recovered themselves. The star on her forehead went out, and a soft light bathed her as she took slowly to the croon of adoring strings, the 18 paces forward. We saw her first as a queen alone, next as a queen for the first time conscious of her subjects, and at the end, when her hands fluttered, as a woman delighted, awed not a little, but transfigured and illuminated with sheer compelling affection and goodwill. I caught the broken mutter of welcome, the coo, which is more than tornadoes of applause. It died and rose and died again lovingly. She's got it across, Bat whispered. I've never seen her like this. I told her to light up the star, but I was wrong and she knew it. She's an artist. Dal, you darling, someone spoke, not loudly, but it carried through the house. Thank you, Dal answered, and in that broken tone one heard the last fetter riveted. Good evening, boys. I've just come from... Now, where the deuce was it I've come from? She turned to the impassive files of the gubby dancers and went on, so good of you to remind me, you dear bun-faced things. I've just come from the village that voted the earth was flat. She swept into that song with a full orchestra. It devastated the habitable earth for the next 6 months. Imagine what its rage and pulse must have been at the incandescent hour of its birth. She only gave the chorus once. At the end of the second verse, "Are you with me, boys?" she cried, and the house tore it clean away from her. Earth was flat, flat as my hat, flatter than that, drowning all but the bassoons and double basses that marked the word. Wonderful, I said to Butt, and it's only nuts in May with variations. Yes, but I did the variations, he replied. At the last verse, she gestured to Carlini, the conductor, who threw her up his baton. She caught it with a boy's ease. Are you with me? She cried once more, and the maddened house behind her abolished all the instruments except the guttural belch of the double basses on earth. It was delirium. Then she picked up the gubby dancers and led them in a clattering, improvised lockstep thrice round the stage till her last kick sent her diamond-hilted shoe Catherine-wheeling to the electrolier. I saw the forest of hands raised to catch it, heard the roaring and stamping pass through hurricanes to full typhoon, heard the song pinned down by the faithful double basses as the bulldog pins down the bellowing bull, overbear even those, till at last the curtain fell and Bat took me round to her dressing room where she lay spent after her 7th call. Still the song, through all those whitewashed walls, shook the reinforced concrete of the trefoil as steam pile drivers shake the flanks of a dock. I'm all out. First time in my life. Tell a fellow now, did I get it across? She whispered huskily. You know you did, I replied, as she dipped her nose deep in a beaker of barley water. They cooed over you. Bat nodded. And poor Nellie's dead. In Africa, ain't it? I hope I'll die before they stop cooing, said Dal. I thought of that story and Nuts and May with variations when Beyonce brought out Single Ladies, and I was listening to this and thinking, this is going to sweep the earth, but it is a kind of child's playground song with variations. Kipling knew what he was talking about. I think I'm not going to get round to my story. I'm just going to read... well, buy the book, it's fabulous. I'm going to read a little bit from I think the author who is, for me, he's the greatest of all British writers of short stories. And he slightly disappeared, and I don't know why. I really don't know why. It's V.S. Pritchett. I think the day that I discovered what Pritchett could do, it was like the sun coming out. I was astonished, really. And I think it was because Penguin used to bring out this volume of the selected or collected stories of V.S. Pritchett with a picture of Pritchett on the front. And Pritchett was, a remarkable man, a remarkable mind. But his photograph had this old buffer with a pipe and cardigan and a tie on. And it must have put so many people off by this book. But as soon as you read Pritchett, he is a writer of such kind of energy and decisiveness and such kind of insight into particular moments of society. And he just sees what a particular corner of the human comedy is like. More than anything, he has a wonderful ear for how people talk. And one of the forms that I kept coming across when I was reading for this anthology was the monologue, sort of stage monologue. And I didn't really like most of them. I thought they were a bit kind of artificial. I thought they were a bit like, I like Joyce Grenfell on stage, but actually written down, I think there's something a little bit fake about it, apart from Pritchett. And Pritchett's monologues are simply sensational. And the one that I put in is called the Camberwell Beauty, and it's narrated by an antiques dealer. And antiques dealers, I think, have a very characteristic, they can have a very characteristic way of talking, which is often designed to impress the listener with their knowledge and their confidence and their reliability, and is not necessarily always very convincing. And this is I've read this over and over and over again, trying to see how it's done, and I still can't tell you. Augusts on the Bath Road. Twice 5 August. Of course I knew August. Ivory man. And the woman who lived with him, her name was Price. She's dead. He went out of business years ago. He's probably dead too. I was in the trade only 3 or 4 years, but I soon knew every antique dealer in the south of England. I used to go to all the sales. Name another. Knaisley of Close Place, Jades, Asiatics, never touched India. Allsop of Ramsey, Ephemera, Marbright, High Street Boxley, George and Silver. Fox? Are you referring to Fox of Denton or Fox of Camden, William Morris, Art Nouveau, or the Fox brothers in the Portobello Road? The eldest stuttered. They had an uncle in Brighton who went mad looking for old Waterford. Hindmith? No, he was just a copier. Ah, now, Pliny. He was a very different cup of tea. Corkley ware. Colport took it over in 1821. I'm speaking of specialities. Furniture is the bread and butter of the trade. It keeps a man going while his mind is on his speciality. And within that speciality, there's one object he broods on from one year to the next, most of his life. The thing a man would commit murder to get his hands on if he had the nerve. But I've never heard of a dealer who had. Theft, perhaps. A stagnant lot. But he does get hold of the thing, but if he does get hold of the thing, he will never let it go, or certainly not to a customer. Dealers only really like dealing among themselves. But every other dealer in the trade knows he's got it. So they sit in their shops, reading the catalogues and watching one another. Fox broods on something Allsop has. Allsop has his eye on Pliny, and Pliny puts a hand to one of his big red ears when he hears the name of August. At the heart of the trade is lust, but a lust that is a dream, paralysed by itself. So paralysed that the only release, the only hope, as everyone knows, is disaster. A bankruptcy, a divorce, a court case, a burglary, trouble with the police, a death. Perhaps then the grip on some piece of treasure will weaken and fall into the watcher's hands, and even if it goes elsewhere, he will go on dreaming about it. What was it that Pliny, gentleman Pliny, wanted of a man like August, who was not much better than a country junk dealer? When I opened up in London, I thought it was a particular Staffordshire figure, but Pliny was far above that. These figures fetch very little, though one or two are hard to find. The Burnie of Cranmer, for example. Very few were made, it never sold, and the firm dropped it. I was young and eager, and one day when a collector, a scholarly man as dry as a stick, came to my shop and told me he had a complete collection except for this piece, I said in my innocent way, "You've come to the right man. I'm fairly certain I can get it for you, at a price." This was a lie, but I was astonished to see the old man look at me with contempt, then light up like a fire, and when he left, look back furtively at me. He had betrayed his lust. You rarely see an antique shop standing on its own. There are usually 3 or 4 together watching one another. I asked the advice of the man next door who ran a small boatyard on the canal in his spare time. He said, "Try Pliny down the green, he knows everyone." I went over the water to Pliny. He was closed, but I did find him at last in a sale room. Pliny was marking his catalogue and waiting for the next lot to come up, and he said to me in a scornful way, slapping a young man down, "August's got it." I saw him wink at the man next to him as I left. I had bought myself a fast red car that annoyed the older dealers, and I drove down the other side of Newbury on the Bath Road. August's was one of 4 little shops opposite the Lion Hotel on the main road at the end of the town where the country begins, and there I got my first lesson. The place was closed. I went across to the bar of the hotel, and August was there, a fat man of 60 in wide trousers and a drip to his nose, who was paying for drinks from a bunch of dirty notes in his jacket pocket and dropping them on the floor. He was drunk and very offended when I picked a couple up and gave them to him. He'd just come back from Newbury races. I humoured him, but he kept rolling about and turning his back to me half the time, so I blurted out, "I've just been over at the shop. You've got some Staffordshire, I hear." He stood still and looked me up and down, and the beer swelled in him. "Who may you be?" he said with all the pomposity of drink. I told him. I said right out, "Staffordshire, Cranmer's burning." His face went dead and the colour of liver. "So's London," he said, and turned away to the bar. I'm told you might have it. I've got a collector," I said. "Give this lad a glass of water," said August to the barmaid. "He's on fire." There's nothing more to say about the evening or of the many other visits I made to August, except it has a moral to it, and I had to help August over to his shop, where an enormous woman, much taller than he, in a black dress, and a little girl of 14 or so, were at the door waiting for him. The girl looked frightened and ran a few yards from the door as August and his woman collided, belly to belly. "Come back," called the woman. The child crept back, and to me, the woman said, "We're closed," and having got the 2 inside, shut the door in my face. The moral is this: if the Burnie of Cranmer was August's treasure, it was hopeless to try and get it before he had time to guess what mine was. Thank you. Questions from the audience? I'm sorry I didn't have time to read my short story. It's very, very good.
So, any questions? Can you just
Sorry.
bear with us a moment for the microphone, and we'll be with you. There's a microphone there.
Okay.
Oh, right. I said I usually have a question, but in fact you so mystified me by that last one that it blotted everything else out. I couldn't come to terms with it. I couldn't grip it. It slipped away from me. It was too eel-like, and it got away from me. So I'm sorry.
Well, it's always worth reading Pritchett twice.
I think I have to. Maybe.
Yes. I think the short story that he regarded as his best short story, it's called When My Girl Comes Home. It's a very kind of rambling and absorbing short story, and when you get to the end, you read the last line and you realise that you've completely misunderstood the whole story. He's a very, very slippery writer, but he is wonderful. I really recommend him.
Do we have any other questions?
I don't know. Virginia Woolf, she's so in need of bringing to readership, isn't she? I don't know. I don't know, really. I didn't really like her short stories. The thing is, actually, that there are short stories by Virginia Woolf that Virginia Woolf scholars are always saying, this is a marvellous short story. It is so innovative and fresh. I can't remember what it's called. There's one called something like Hyde Park, or what is it called? You know the one. Kew Gardens. Yeah, I knew it was named after a park. Kew Gardens, and everyone says this is such an extraordinary, innovative short story. Well, I can tell you, actually, if you read through the journals of the time, it's not a very original short story. It's one those kind of vignettes of scattered impressions. The Adelphi and other magazines of new writing published a lot of short stories in a similar vein. I was very determined. I wasn't going to put writers in who are mostly famous for their novels if I didn't really like their short stories. Some of the people that I left out were really difficult to leave out, and the one that I did leave out, but he fell at the absolute last hurdle, was E.M. Forster, and I love E.M. Forster, but in the end I just thought the short stories they're not really in need of rescue, and they don't really stand up on their own. At least the ones that he published in his lifetime. I think the ones that came out after his death are sometimes more worth defending. Anyway, Virginia Woolf's short stories, they're in paperback. You don't have to, I haven't suppressed Virginia Woolf's short stories. They're there.
So I think we've got another question here first, and then on the front row.
Yes. Well, it's not difficult to publish short stories. It's now impossible. Nobody publishes short stories in this country. In America, it's slightly better. New Yorker publishes short stories, but here there's no way of publishing short stories. It's been handed over really to to a kind of competition economy, and people say, well, what are you complaining about? You can go in for this prize, and the first prize is £30,000, and well, I can tell you, if you'd said to Conan Doyle, you might like to enter Silver Blaze for a competition, and you'll have to put on a dinner jacket and shake somebody's hand before we're prepared to pay you for your work, he might actually have found the idea slightly humiliating, really. So I think I just don't understand why a newspaper doesn't do what it used to do and just publish a short story once a week. I mean, always reading celebrity profiles of people I've read a million times, celebrity profiles a million times before. Why not fill that space with a short story and pay somebody £1,000 for it once a week? So I don't know the answer to your question, really. I do know that if people don't start paying writers to write short stories, then there's no reason whatsoever to think that the form will still exist in 20 years' time, really. I mean, why devote yourself to a literary form that there's no way of extracting any kind of living from it? Literary forms do die out. I mean, people used to write epics all the time. They don't write verse epics anymore, do they, as far as I know? Court masks.
Yeah. Another question there, I think.
No, well, Yes, I discovered a lot of. I mean, these are the people much more than, leaving out Virginia Woolf that I really worry about, because at the end, I had a pile of about 350 short stories, really exceptional short stories, and they had to be reduced. There's only 80 short stories, and there are some people who you can't leave out. And the people that fell away at the last, some of them, I did have the feeling maybe I'm the first person to read this short story since 1912, and it was a stunning short story. There's a couple that I put in that have never been republished. No, more than a couple. There's about. I would be very surprised if. I would be very surprised if any readers have heard of all the authors in this book. There's one by a man called T. Baron Russell from the 1890s that was never reprinted, as far as I can work out. Absolutely sensational short story. There's a great short story by a man called Jack Common from the 1930s. He was a friend of George Orwell, but he had a brief career, and then his career just kind of failed. It's about a working class couple going for their first date to see a production of La Bohème. It's one of the most wonderful, heart-rending, touching, glorious stories. And Jack Common just kind of disappeared. It's a very strange one. There were quite a lot of discoveries. There were some writers who I kind of knew about but hadn't really read, and I thought I was quite well informed for having heard of them. One of them is a woman called Malachi Whitaker, who published 4 volumes of short stories between 1929 and 1935, and then just stopped publishing. And they weren't very successful at the time. She was quite praised by critics, but she never sold. She never sold very very much at all. It lived another 40 years in complete obscurity. And I read the volumes from beginning to end, and my breath was taken away by the inventiveness and the cleverness and the tone of voice. And Malachi Whitaker is my main recommendation for a major revival. So yes, there are a lot of new discoveries, I think. I wish there had been more. I did try to persuade my editor to make the anthology twice as long, but he wouldn't have that.
And I think we've got another question there, the lady at the back.
Well, I was really excluding the first-person memoir. There aren't stories like that in them, but there are short stories by people who lived in those kind of communities, who wrote short stories about other people who also lived in those communities. I mean, Israel Zangwill's short stories are about the butcher just up the road, or the lady who lives next door, and they're quite folky, but they're not kind of first person. They're not first person memoirs. There wasn't much of a hunger, I don't think, for the first person memoir as such. Remember that these short stories were being published in magazines where the readership was very hungry to find stuff out. So you might have a short story followed by an article about a tribe in Africa, or about what it's like to make gunpowder or something like that. So it's always kind of looking outwards. It's very rarely somebody just saying, this is my life, this is just what's happened to me. It's more about, this is my kind of community, I think.
Any other questions? The gentleman here.
I know, it's you have to turn your eye, as an anthologist, you have to turn your eye against what other people have selected as an anthology piece, and it is one of the. I mean, the one that drove me up the wall was Elizabeth Bowen. I thought I'd have Elizabeth Bowen in, you know. Just, everyone said, no, she's not British, she's British. But I was like, she's British, I like her. And everybody who everybody who puts Elizabeth Bowen in, they choose one of the same two stories. They either put Mysterious Core in, or they put Ivy Gripped the Steps. And I don't know, I do think there's a way in which authors just kind of are reduced to their greatest hits in a way. And I think it was really your duty as an anthologist to look away from that and see what else there is there in an author's work. Having said that, he was one of the people who fell at the last hurdle. I know. There were other people who fell quite early on because I couldn't stand them. And I tell you, if anybody's inclined to stand up for H.E. Bates, I really recommend 2 days in the London Library reading his collected works. I can tell you, one story in 11 by H.E. Bates begins with the nightingales singing in the orchards. Like, what? Just do something. Anyway, so I left H.E. Bates out. The H.E. Bates Society won my head on a pole. They really did.
So, unfortunately, no H.E. Bates, or maybe fortunately, no H.E. Bates. But
H.E. Bates is fine.
I think we have time for one last question. There's a question there,
Yeah.
Gabriella. Bear with us a second. And
Yeah, it's a lovely idea. I don't know, actually. If you were a living author, would you like to read that you were considered and rejected? I don't know. There are some people who I did actually say I'm really, really sorry in the introduction. I just couldn't find space for this wonderful writer, you know. And Helen Dunmore I absolutely adore, but it just wouldn't. There just wasn't space, you know. Gerard Woodward I think is a wonderful, wonderful short story writer. Again, you know, if you put, you know, everybody you wanted to, and maybe I should have put the names of the illustrious dead in. I'd considered and left out. If you write to me, I've got the list somewhere. So
we're all going to have to work out who's been left out. But
you know, there's 80 authors there, so you know there's quite a lot to be getting on with.
So I think on that note, I hope you'll join me in thanking Philip Hensher for the most wonderful, wonderful tour de force of the British short story. I'm sure.